So the last 2 days, we've been talking a lot about disruption and what disruption does to us. But hopefully you've been in some conversations where you've been talking to people who have been intentionally leading disruption in organizations in the service of trying to create more efficient, more effective processes across the organization. And that's what we're here to talk about today. 3 years ago, I'm sure some of you were with us when we started a pretty disruptive conversation in the world of performance management. And Rob Olander Crane was certainly one of the early instigators of, in a performance management process, not only making a pretty radical transformation in how we structure the process, but also in removing end-of-year ratings. So we want to see where we go today. And one of the things that is a little different about this session, and Josh hinted at that, is that typically at NLI, in many of our sessions, we have a point of view. You know, this is what we think we should do. We're not so much today. We have some great ideas. Jay's going to give us some hints from science as well. But we really want to hear from you as we go through the session and after. What are your ideas as well? We want to hear from you. How are you rethinking talent reviews? So perhaps a year from now, we will have a more informed point of view. We'll take this in 3 chapters. We'll start off with what are some compelling reasons why we should be rethinking talent reviews and specifically the 9-box. We'll hear about some fresh approaches and take a look into the crystal ball and see what might be next. So the question becomes, with kind of hanging on to a traditional process like the 9-box, have we boxed ourselves in? Now, the 9-box started in the 1970s, and it was created by McKinsey for GE. And the purpose of the 9-box was to help GE evaluate its investments in over 150 business units. 1990s, the 9-box got updated, and names such as you see on the slides here were plugged in, and now it's being used to evaluate, our investment in individuals. So, are we using a process that very much like performance management? So if you go back to performance management in, the 1990s, a more traditional approach, force distribution, ratings, it sounds very logical. And for those of us in HR, it feels objective, and it gives us a lot of certainty. And in some ways, the 9-box creates that same, and I am going to call it an illusion, as we'll unpack in this first chapter, of knowing where all of our talent fits. We'll fit them into the right box, and then that's going to help us know how to develop them. And when we have an opening, we'll be able to go back to the 9-box and just pluck an individual, and we'll be ready to go. However, a lot of unintended consequences with this approach. Part of why we think there's a case for change starts with just simply the return on investment of the time that managers and HR in your organizations commit to this process. So get in mind a typical talent review period in your organization, whether it's once a year or twice a year. And I think you probably are going to feel at home with some of these examples. So it's the beginning of talent review time. It's instruction to your managers to do what? All right, get your defenses ready for your folks, because managers know they have a calibration session coming up. So they're going to spend hours either filling out reports or trying to document the best way to advocate for their employees, and also probably stress a lot about, what box should this person be in. Now it's time for the dreaded calibration discussions, and there are informal and formal discussions around calibration. And arguments, I'm sure we could call it healthy discussion, but the discussions a lot of times are focused on what box does Sue fit in, rather than how does Sue need to be developed to get to the next level. All of this takes a lot of time. Once we make our recommendations about who's where in the 9 box, it gets kicked upstairs. Senior management has to sign off on it. So maybe we're 6 months, 9 months down the road. Well, by the time there's an opening, a couple of those people have left, whatever the case. And guess who, in many cases, we've left out of the picture? The employee. In many organizations, 9 box discussions are not shared with the employee. They have to figure out, am I high potential or what? And it's not really a good fit for what we're seeing about today's workplace. Another interesting little factoid that CEB calculated, and if you use 9 box for succession planning, start doing the math for your own organization. So one manager in a typical year using 9 box for succession planning spends 182 hours. How many weeks is that? 4.5 weeks. If you have 1,000 managers, quickly do the math. And I think that's 87 years. So in the course of 1 year, your managers cumulatively are spending 87 years of time in this process. Are you really getting the return on investment that you want? The second piece about this, the second data point, is that leaders pre-identified in a succession plan, the success rate is only 25%. So 28%. And would you, as a talent leader, as an HR professional, would you advocate for a process that is missing the mark 75% of the time? I don't think so. What do employees want, in this day and age? Well, I think during the course of the last couple of days, we've talked a lot about it. We were just in a session on career and careering into the future. And we're all hearing loud and clear that today's employees want opportunities to learn and grow. They want to, be free to use their own judgment about their own careers. And if we give them those things, they vote for the company. And they want to say so in how they're mapping their career. And they also want to know, behind closed doors, if we're having talent reviews, how are they impacted? What's being said? And how can they be in on the discussion? So think about, how can you introduce more of those elements into your talent review process? The other point is this definition of potential. So in a traditional 9 box, we've got performance on the x-axis, potential on the y typically. And what does potential mean in today's world? If you take a look at this quote from Mercer, the kind of the skills that we might be assessing people for today, dramatically change in a very short period of time. So is potential for upward mobility? Is it for lateral mobility? And what got Susie to this point in the organization may not get her where she needs to go next. So it becomes a much more complicated, I think, conversation that we need to think through. So 3, I hope, pretty compelling starting points for discussion on the case for change. I'm going to invite Jay to come share with us what science says might be even more important reasons why we've boxed ourselves in with the 9-box process.
Thank you, Beth. So Beth has spoken a lot about the challenges of using the 9-box, the costs. I'm going to talk to you about some additional scientific challenges that you face when you're dealing with evaluating people. Oops. Can I go back one? Okay. So the first thing that I think of when we're judging other people is that the mind and the brain immediately start engaging in unconscious processes that aren't strictly rational. So I don't know how many people here heard this week, but the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Richard Thaler, and his basic contribution that won him the Nobel Prize was that humans aren't rational. We have numerous shortcuts and biases that we use when we're judging any type of decision, but that's especially true in social decisions. And so what we see is that the mind immediately jumps to conclusions about people that aren't necessarily accurate, and we have a number of specific types of biases that we bring to bear when we're making these judgments. And again, this is especially powerful when we're making social judgments, whether we evaluate somebody as a good performer or a bad performer, or having potential to move up. And so I'm just going to walk through the SEEDS model here to give you a summary, distilling across over 150 type of biases. What are the core components, the essence of bias that might be at play when you're evaluating people's performance and potential? The first one is that distance plays in. And so when you're thinking about somebody, how they performed this year, what their potential is, you're more likely to have more accurate information about people close to you. But if you have people at another office in another country or you're used to interacting with them over Skype, you might not be thinking of them, and they might not be at the front of your mind when you're evaluating them. And those types of blind spots can lead you to overweight people who are close to you. Even somebody who's just down the hall or has an office in your building, that might be something that nudges you to give them a better evaluation, even though it's totally irrelevant to performance and potential. Another one is similarity. We tend to like people who are similar to us, even if that similarity is completely irrelevant. So research finds, for example, if you learn that somebody has the same birthday as you like them more. This is automatic, unconscious, but it has nothing to do with their performance as a competent and intelligent person in your organization. It's just one of the biases that our brain uses to decide whether or not we like somebody. Another core one is experience. And so if we have one or two really memorable experiences of somebody, those are exactly the type of things that come up in conversations when we're evaluating them. But it might not be representative of all the thousands of things they've done over the whole year when you're making these evaluations. But if it's really memorable, and we know that memory is faulty and biased, and tends to jump to memories that are emotional and have kind of rich, vivid mental representations, those are exactly the type of things that are going to go into our performance evaluations, even though, again, they're not strictly rational and they're not based on the things that we should care about when we're judging performance and potential. Another one is safety. When people make performance evaluations using the 9-box, they tend to not want to offend people. And so they're more likely to overrate people's potential and performance because they don't want to give them bad information afterwards. And so they're avoiding potential social conflict, harmed feelings. Again, that's moving us away from making accurate judgments. And the final one is expedience. As Beth rightly pointed out, these processes are enormously time-consuming, but they're often on a timeline and a schedule. And when you're pressed to make decisions in a short period of time, whether it's evaluating people's performance or hiring people and looking at resumes, we often do it very quickly, and that's exactly the type of situation where you start using shortcuts just to get through it or to resolve potential conflict among the people who are making the evaluations. So all of these biases are feeding in this process to where you put somebody and how you're going to fit them into a certain box on the 9-box. And from the main take-home here is that people are rational. They use shortcuts and have biases, and these are especially powerful in social judgments. Now, the problem with that is not just that you're rating people inaccurately relative to where they'd be rated if it was a purely rational process. The other thing is that when they get the feedback about where they rank, especially I think with potential, you can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is based on very famous research where they told teachers, they randomly selected some students and told the teachers that these students had high potential. What happened over the course of the term is that the teachers started treating those kids differently. The ones that they thought had talent or potential got more attention, more positive feedback, more challenging assignments. And then by the end of the year, those students did better. Even though they didn't have more potential, But as long as it was implanted in the teacher's mind, they engaged in actions that made that come true. And so this is exactly the type of problem downstream that you get when you miscategorize people as having high or low potential. You're going to treat the people who've been targeted as potential stars with more support, mentorship, opportunities, and the people who you were told have no potential are going to get treated worse. You're going to block them from opportunities. That seems rational, but it can cause these problems. And if it's based on biased judgments in the first place, you're allowing your bias to create a self-fulfilling prophecy that could lead you to encourage and promote the wrong people. And I think more concerningly to me is discourage and demotivate many people who would otherwise be potentially successful performers. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Beth.
Great. Thanks, Jay. So I'd love to start with our panelist, and Rob, if you don't mind, we'll kick off with you. And I know in the next chapter we're going to hear what GAP is doing differently. But what was the business case for you? What got your attention about this process and motivated you to want to do something different?
Well, my hunch is that this description that I'm about to present to all of you is similar to what you experience in your organizations. When your managers come together for the calibration discussion, you spend all your time trying to make sure they're in the right box. It's often contentious, and you walk out thinking you've achieved success because everybody's agreed to the placement of your talent in those boxes. And to us, that's just the beginning of the conversation. The more important piece of the conversation is creating development plans that help people to actually do something differently so we can get a better return on our investment in them in the future and they can get a better career trajectory. We felt that we were spending so much time with the 9-box placing people in the right place that we never got to development. And yet all of our managers thought they had done such a good job because we checked off the box and got them all in the right place. So we were really compelled by that notion that nothing is going to change unless you get to the development part of the conversation. That was kind of our burning platform, get to development.
Excellent. Greg, what are your thoughts about why we should rethink this process?
Yeah, so we're kind of in the process of this right now. I'd say, very similar to what's been said, one of the reasons why we are looking at, is the 9-box really getting done what we need to get done. Development's obviously a key aspect of that. There's two other things, though, as well. The next is allocation of talent. There was a thought that the 9-box would help us figure out where we could leverage people and people that were ready to grow and how could we actually get them to grow. It was actually a really poor tool to do that, is what we found. It was really narrow in how we thought about folks. So somebody might have high potential, but they might be potential just to do their manager's job or something in a very narrow lane. It really didn't allow us to understand, how do we better allocate talent? And then the third really category that has caused us to question all this is around, we looked at the 9-box as some sort of measure of the sustainability of our talent in the organization, right? This is a profile of, do we have enough talent for the future kind of thing. And as we dug into that, it's also really not a great measure of that either. So, we were continuing to find we had new opportunities in the organization, new capability needs, what have you, and we didn't have the talent, and yet, our box 1, 2, and 4 participation continued to go up, and yet we didn't feel like we were in a better place from a talent perspective. So for us, it was probably less about, although we completely mirror exactly what you said, it was less about the frustration of the time piece. It was about, we need these tools to help us manage the organization. And right now, we've been over-leveraging the 9-box to try to do that, and in a lot of cases, it was an illusion of giving us some precision where precision didn't exist.
Excellent. Mary, I want to come to you, and you have, you hold the record for the C's, CHRO, CTO, CLO, and head of D&I as part of your career path, so you've seen it all. And you love the 9-box or not?
I'm not sure saying that it's insidious would be entirely accurate, but it's close. For those of us that have been part of that conversation about changing performance management over the years, this is a first cousin to changing performance management because it's the same but worse, actually, Beth, I think, because the implications for it in terms of the impact that it has not only on the individual, but the organization are magnified. Many of the talent management functions are sort of the tip of the spear, even heading into succession planning. And when you have a process, which I think much of talent management's pretty politicized inside of an organization, we can talk more about that over the course of our dialogue, but you're actually putting the organization at risk, in my view, that you think that you have a process in place that actually gives you insight, and it doesn't. You know, it doesn't really change the performance of the organization. So it's well worth, I think, inspecting and deciding what are the elements, because there are some that work inside of talent management, but does this 9-box structure actually produce the outcome that we want it to produce? And I think not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's no question, organizations do have to identify who is your promising talent and make the proper investments, because organizations don't have unlimited resources. So I don't think any of us disagree on that point, but there has to be a better way. We're going to give you a few minutes to digest, think about where you are on the spectrum of openness to change, the 9-box process, and then we'll go into trying to tease out some ideas for a fresh approach. So find a partner, have a quick discussion. So let's put some ideas out about a better way to approach this. And I'm going to ask Rob from the Gap to share the podium and walk us through the approach that the Gap is now using. And then we'll also hear from Greg and Mary. It's just the green button.
Didn't know that I was going to need to stand up. It actually gets me closer to all you all. I feel so far away over there. Plus those chairs squeak. Can you hear that when we move? It's real disconcerting. So for those of you who are not familiar with the company that I work with, this is like, for those of you who don't know how to buckle a seat, put a seatbelt together, right? The 1% of you who don't know my company, it's Gap, Banana Republic, and Old Navy. I'm sure you all know those companies, yeah? How many of you know Athleta? Ooh, I love it. And how many of you know Intermix? A few. That's our contemporary women's business. Now, please stand up if you're wearing something from one of my companies. Okay, the rest of you need to leave now. So we're 140,000 employees globally. We're in 40 countries in brick and mortar, 90 countries in our web presence. We're a pretty big company to change anything in the talent space. But I want to start by talking about performance management. Mary, you paved the way for me to talk about this. So some of you may have heard me talk here at one of these NLI summits or somewhere else about the change we made to performance management. And why it's important to talk about this is for the very reason Mary mentioned it. It's the same change. We are going from, in performance management, a very documented and formal process, one that's annual, not regular, one that's threat-producing. For all of you who are familiar with the SCARF model, it's a threat-producing discussion that's really just meant to allocate reward. There's just no evidence to support that it drives performance. So we got rid of that 4 years ago at the Gap. And instead, we went to something that's non-documented and informal. There's nothing documented in our process at all unless you're on corrective action. Frequent discussion. We went to 12 times a year. Now we're just about to go to real-time feedback because we think our teams are ready for that. Something that's reward-producing. We grounded our program in growth mindset, and everything about it is built around learning and becoming a master over time. It's less about that punitive, you made a mistake. It's more about what did you learn and how you're going to apply that learning to the future. But here's the key. In blue, it's meant to develop and engage. I think if you look at traditional performance management, there isn't a lot of development going on. And we wanted this talent process to be about development and engagement. Well, I think we can say the same about talent planning. So the from side is this 9-box, focus on performance and potential. And I say it's threat producing around potential. I may be totally wrong. I'm looking at the scientists here to back me up. I think that it's really difficult for managers to assess performance. I think when the performance is good, it's pretty easy for them to do. But when the performance isn't good, they're reluctant to say you suck, right? No one wants to do that radical candor thing and say you suck. It's hard for managers. It's a threat in the brain and maybe in other places. I think the same thing on steroids, to Mary's point, happens when you're talking about potential. Could you imagine having to tell someone you have no potential? It's really what you have potential for, right? It's not you have no potential. And the 9 box at least makes people think that they have no potential if they're in the bottom left-hand corner of that box. That feels really bad. I think that creates a threat in the mind of a manager who has to do that exercise. So I'm looking over here at Jay. Am I right?
Yep.
Okay, good. So we wanted to get rid of this threat-producing thing. As I mentioned before, our leaders spent the majority of their time just trying to get the person in the right box. And those contentious discussions, these arguments about whether someone's in 9 or 8 or 7, like who cares which box they're in if that's all you're doing? We never got to the discussion of development. We spent all these hours that Beth was telling us about just putting people in boxes for no reason. And then finally, we focused this discussion, when we brought all these leaders together, on every employee. But you don't need to talk about every employee. Some of the employees the manager needs to take care of because they're doing their job and you want to leave them alone. And others, we want to give them bigger jobs. And maybe that manager doesn't have that job, doesn't have the place for them. Those are the people you want to talk about in these discussions. But you bring leaders together and they say, no, but I want to talk about all my people. I want you to know every one of my people. And that wastes time. So we wanted to get rid of that. And instead, we went to what we call the Foursquare. And I'm going to show you what the Foursquare is in a minute. You are welcome to steal it. It's focused on development actions. You will see that the language of the Foursquare does not look like that 9 box that Beth showed us before. It looks entirely different. We spend the majority of our time discussing development. It's an idea we learned from Starbucks. When they bring their leaders together, they have 50 flip charts in the room, each with a different development idea. And when they talk about a person, they say, okay, which one of those ideas do we want to use on this person? So they really focused on development. We thought that was a great idea. And we call it the talent exchange. We no longer call it talent planning, TEX for short, because this is an opportunity to exchange knowledge about talent and, more importantly, to actually exchange talent across the enterprise. We wanted to move to some kind of enterprise focus, not a siloed approach. That's what we're going to. This is what it looks like. Say ooh, say ah. Wow, you guys are awake. I love it. Let me talk about what this is. But first, drink it in a little bit. Take a read. So let's start with the gray words that are up there. In the upper right-hand corner, you see feed them more. Feed them more. That's a development action. That's something we want to do with some of our employees. And boy, it's so easy for a manager to say, I think this person needs more right now. That's an easy thing for them to assess and to say. Upper left-hand corner, stay the course. My person is fine, leave them alone. They're doing fine, maybe they're in a new role, maybe they're a little overwhelmed right now, they're doing great, leave them alone, stay the course, keep them engaged. Bottom right-hand corner, figure it out. Those are people that we've seen perform in the past, but for some reason, they just aren't cutting it in this role. How many of you have worked for a manager that it just didn't feel right, you didn't really want to be there, your performance kind of, I see a few hands, your performance went down. How many of you have seen that in employees where they were great one day and now they're working for this manager and they suck? Well, if they performed in the past, chances are there's something going on in that relationship or in that job or in that division. We don't want to lose those people. We know they perform. The development action is figure it out. It's an enterprise discussion because can't stay with me if I'm the bad manager, right? And finally, on the lower left-hand side is up or out. That is really people who are on corrective action. Those are people who, for whatever reason, are just not cutting it in our organization. Much easier, from my perspective, for our managers to do this exercise. Also remember, we are not an engineering firm. We're not in Silicon Valley. We're a bunch of creatives who make product. My designers have no time to talk about a 9 box. This they'll talk about. This works for them. It's kind of amazing. You put this in front of them, and they can plop their people in here really quickly. And we don't argue with them about where they put the person. We trust that they know their people because they're doing the performance management process where they're talking to their people all year long. We're treating them like adults instead of having this contentious conversation. There's some other information in here. You can see that we do give some descriptive language here about what's in each of these boxes, but it's development language for the most part. And we do identify actions that we think these people should take if someone sits in one of these boxes. It radically changes the conversation, and it takes away a lot of the threat. The last thing I want to point out is there's 2 columns, one that says manager owns. When someone ends up in stay the course or up or out, it's the manager's responsibility to take care of that person. We don't talk about those people when we come together. When they're in feed them more, I probably can't feed them more in the role that they're in. I probably have to give them to some other manager who's got a job with a bigger scope. So I want to talk to my peers about those people and then figure it out. I might be that manager who's it's just not working well. I got to place that person somewhere else. So we talk about the people on the right side, not all the employees on the left side. So just one more slide, results. This has been widely adopted in our company. I can't tell you how it was like pushing a wet snowball up a warm hill every time we tried to do talent planning with the 9-box. We just could not get traction unless we cracked the whip and said, you must do this. Now all of a sudden people want to do it. They say, we're going to do this text process. It's not time consuming. It's a much more engaging discussion because it's all around development. I don't know why I'm looking up there when I have it down here. Significantly less time discussing which square people belong in. That pretty much goes away. We trust the manager, and development's actually happening. And here's the most interesting statistic. Beth shared with us that 28% of succession candidates on a bench chart actually get placed. I don't even think we were at 28%. We did not have real bench before. Now we do. When I look at our critical roles, pretty much every critical role that's turned since we've started this process has been placed by someone on a bench chart, which means we have real bench, not fake administrative bench. And that, to me, is the biggest indicator that this is working. So again, you're allowed to steal this, take it, make it real, bring it to the world, get rid of this awful talent planning process that we know. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Rob. I just want to go back to the 4-box, and a couple of things that pop out. Four square, no box. We are done with the box. But the up or out, it really takes the question of no potential off the table, because someone can have potential, but it might not be the right potential for this organization. So seems to me, it makes it easier for a manager to put somebody in the up or out box.
It's a much easier conversation.
Yeah, and just the language, it's a call to action. It's telling you what to do with each person.
Yeah, you don't see the word potential anywhere on that page.
Yeah.
It's gone. It doesn't mean that we don't assess potential. We use Egon Zehnder. We have a formal assessment process, mostly for our most critical roles, VP and above, and that's, to your point, potential for a particular role. We do that work. It just doesn't show up here.
Well, the other thing I want to point out is you got rid of any feedback that they don't have potential. So 3 of those cells in the 9-box are gone. Mm-hmm. You got rid of the threat.
Right. And think about how respectful this work is for the manager. I mean, so often when we think about 9-box, we think about the impact that it has on the individual employee. But flip that to thinking about the manager that has to be in these meetings. And if you used our SCARF model as an example, so you go in and you have a point of view about an individual, you're the person representing others in your organization. So you go in, you talk about where they fit in the 9-box, and the first thing that happens is somebody with a bigger, badder stick than you says, no, you can't have that. So there goes your status right off the bat, right? Certainty. You go in believing that you know in the people that you lead, and all you get is pushback the entire time, and everybody that looking at you going into these meetings thinks, oh, it's a hopeless cause. Who knows what happens behind those doors? Autonomy, stripped away as well, too. You don't get the chance. In your example, it's great. You trust your managers to do what they're supposed to be doing. Relatedness, the people that are representing them are the ones that are supposed to know them the best. Right? Not a 9-box, but the managers are supposed to know them the best. And it's hard to find employees that believe that a 9-box would be held up as the fairest process, in human resources. So kudos to you for hitting on a lot of great elements of making it much more of a reward than a threat.
Greg, thoughts from you about what's popping up for you? What might be next for Cigna?
Yeah, well, we've been experimenting with some stuff, and actually, there's a lot of parallels here. We don't have it kind of this neatly defined. But we've tried two things this year. One was we constructed a conversation explicitly around development, and we focused on transition. So we looked at our organization. It's a very dynamic time for healthcare. It's dynamic for our industry. Mobility across the organization is really important. Internal talent and experience is also coming at more and more of a premium because of the complexity that we live in our overall operating model. And so from that, what we noticed in looking at our own data, and I'll use this example, in 2016, 30% of our managers and above were in a transitional role in that year. They just had moved into one. So a promotion, expansion of scope, a stretch role of some kind, a new functional responsibility, what have you, but a major move, 30%. And if you've looked at the research on transitions, a lot of those kind of transitional folks are underperforming. So that's not just true with Insignia, it's true everywhere. People in transitions underperform, and they have an unbelievable impact on those around them. So we said, okay, let's focus one of our conversations. So we have two conversations, main conversations a year with our senior leadership team. Let's focus one on transitions. And consistent with our data, when we looked at the direct reports of our executive team, over 30% of them were in a transitional role. So we focused on each single one of those and talked about, so one thing we did is we shortened distance, right? We didn't talk about a slew of people. We talked about that team's direct reports and focused exclusively on that. And then we focused on the people in transition, and we picked transitions, one, because of the data I said. The other is we also believe that when you're going into a transition, you're more open to new behavior because everything else is already changing. So the odds of them being vulnerable and being more open to any sort of development that we put in front of them, we thought would be much higher than people we're picking off of a 9-box who have been successful forever, who we already are labeling as being able to do more, and they're saying, I need to go learn what? So instead we said, let's try to find them when they're vulnerable and see if we can help them. And so we spent our time, and basically those managers work with their people in transition, and we build out customized transition plans for all of them. Where we spent our time with the leadership team wasn't going through each single development. It was that leader coming in and basically saying, here's the support I need from each of you to make my person in transition successful, right? So at that level, you're talking about enterprise leaders, and they need support from the functional areas because, hey, I just hired a new person that's going to run, X, Y, and Z function. You're going to be the most demanding customer. I need you to make sure that you're setting clear goals and things that are reasonable, et cetera, et cetera. And so we defined all these support roles that each of the ELT could do. Everything, typical ones that you would hear, mentor, coach, but we also had connector, we had sponsor, we had demanding customer. We identified these roles and we let them each figure out, a manager would come in and say, this is the support I need from each of you to make my person successful. What was really great about that conversation, it was built entirely on what was immediately relevant in the organization. Everyone in the room recognized we needed all these people in transitional roles to be successful, and it was focused on what they had to do leaving that room in order to ensure it happened. And so it was a very positive conversation. It wasn't trying to tear these people down. It was really focused on how can we all help to make them successful. So that was one thing that we did. That's translated. We actually had another conversation about those same people in the fall for our fall talent review. And the new conversation we added in the fall was on this talent allocation piece. So, and this I think gets a lot at this feed them more. So we're starting to identify what are the key kind of strategic capabilities we need in the organization that's going to generate value for us in our growth path. And so I'll give an example. One might be innovation. Right? Innovation is something that we need to have happen. So we take that kind of key value creator and we break it down into what are the key activities that need to happen in order for innovation to happen, and then who do we have that we think are really difference makers around those activities. And so we identified that. We identified where we had gaps around those capabilities and action plans against it. What came out of that meeting, and this is literally 2 weeks ago, we're still actioning it, but the most kind of eye-opening thing was a lot of the talent that we identified that could be a difference maker around a capability might have been a 5-box or a 7-box. Those folks would never have gotten attention. And because we defined roles as this huge kind of conglomeration of activities. It's always easy to point out what people are not doing. This actually said, well, yeah, but on these 2 or 3, these people are difference makers. And so now how do we leverage them in a way that we get all their strengths kind of brought to the table, knowing that whatever we have them do is going to be a stretch from what they are currently doing. So we might narrow their scope or narrow their focus but broaden their scope. So we'll immediately put them into a transitional support plan as they take on the new behavior. So these schemes kind of come together. So our challenge is really to do what you guys have done, which is how do we make some of these practices scalable? Mm-hmm. You were able to roll something out that the entire organization is impacted. We've just kind of prototyped a little bit at the senior leader level, but those are the conversations that have come into play. And by having, what was interesting at our fall talent review, what got prioritized was we wanted to talk about transitions again. We wanted to talk about this talent allocation. What got deprioritized for the first time ever is we did not explicitly talk about the 9-box in our fall talent review. First time ever. Mm. And so it wasn't about blowing it up and replacing it. It just, there are activities that we need as an organization to be more confident behind. We introduced kind of new ways of having those conversations. And it was amazing that our leadership basically said, you know what, this time we're not going to talk about it. And we'll see where it goes from there. So we're still very much in this kind of figuring it out mode, but that's what we've done.
So we'll look forward to this time next year, you telling us
Maybe
about
we'll have more to say, sure.
Jay.
Yeah, I just had one thing that I love about this. It reduces threat. And I do this work in my own lab. If you can take the exact same feedback or task and frame it through the lens of cooperation, like helping them get engaged, giving them more. It's all framed through the lens of cooperation instead of competition. And when that happens, people start to unconsciously like you more. You're more likely to come to better solutions together as a collective, and you're more likely to stay engaged. And so those are the things that we find over and over again in my lab and other labs. So that's baked into just the language and the way you frame this, and it sounds like Sigma's doing some similar things. So part of it is also the way it's framed as we're working together to solve this problem and make you better.
Great. So that's a lot to digest. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. And also, we'll come to you for a few questions. So mic runners, if you'll get yourselves in position. So take 2 or 3 minutes, talk to a partner, think about questions that you might want to ask our panelists, and we'll hear what they are. I'll ask you, if you would, to please bring your attention back to the stage. And also, let's take a few questions. And so I see 2 hands back here. I see 1 over here. Let's start over here. The back. And if you would just say your name, and we'll get your question answered.
My name is Virginia Diamond, and we have 2 questions. One, for the GAP Foursquare model, how transparent is this with employees? Do they know what box they're in? And then 2, agree letting go of or allocating a reward, right? That's an important thing, but how do you then allocate rewards? How do you figure out raises, compensation, and all that if it's not tied to this kind of performance planning and all of that, and developmental planning? How do you do it?
Yeah, so, wow, we could talk for like 3 hours about that. So let me try to give you the cliff notes. Let me start with the allocation of reward question. So reward is really driven more by our performance management process than our talent planning process. Although there is some interconnection between the two, we expect that managers know their talent and assess their talent and give more reward to the people who are the high performers and less reward to the people who are lower performers. Potential has nothing to do with that equation. LTI is a different story, but strictly for merit and for bonus, there's no connective tissue there. We don't have ratings, but we still expect managers to differentiate performance and allocate reward accordingly. In terms of transparency, God, that is such a difficult question, and we could probably have a whole conversation just about that. I firmly believe that we should be as transparent as possible in everything we do in talent. But you all know, and we all know, that it takes a high level of maturity to be able to hear both the good and the bad. And we're just not there yet. Even GAP, which has been really innovative in performance management and now in talent planning, we don't tell people which box they sit in. Now, if they ask, we'll tell. And because managers do this exercise, the vast majority of, well, not the vast majority, about half of our company is managers in our headquarters location. So if you're a manager, you're also an employee, you know about this. So it gets out there. What we want our managers to discuss with their employees is their development strategy. We think you can do more. Without saying you're in feed them more, we think you can do more. And here's what we think you can do. What do you want to do? And we try to pair those two things up so we can have the best return on our investment in those employees. But to say that we're totally transparent about this, we're not. And we're a long way from getting there. It's hard to make that transition.
All right, thanks. Some back here?
Hi there, good afternoon. Christopher Leedy, Campbell Soup Company. This is incredibly timely and something that we're thinking about at Campbell's as we go into succession and talent planning. You know, we have the enterprise planning from a succession perspective and board and governance and all that good stuff, but we also, like you do, a lot of talent review. And putting pen to paper, kind of rethinking all of this right now, and with the focus and the mindset around how do we drive development plan. When you look at your model, the Foursquare here, are you looking at it through an assessment lens? Like, is there another layer prior to, two questions. Is there another layer prior to this from an assessment to get here? And then how, if you have the need to, are you breaking the mindset between feed them more and what might traditionally be considered high potential?
Wow, it's like you're in my head. That's scary. So you see that thing that says talent type in that line that says name, title, risk, and talent type? Some of our businesses, and they tend to be the more operational businesses like global supply chain, want to slice and dice. And we've given those businesses the opportunity to slice and dice and to be able to get a little bit more granular in descriptions of their talent. And although this is going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, they can identify high potential people if they want. They can identify high professionals if they want. They can identify emerging talent if they want. If they feel that's important to the way in which they look at their talent, we give them a way to do that and a place to record it in the Foursquare. The vast majority of the company doesn't use that and doesn't care about it. So the assessment for most of the people in the company is this development assessment. It's the manager thinking about those 12 conversations of performance with their employee and saying, is this person ready for more? Should they stay the course? Is it a bad fit, or are they just not cutting it and we need to cut the ties? That's all the assessment we expect them to do. And what's magical about that is every manager can do that. They can do it quickly and easily, and they can come to this conversation and have an intelligent conversation about that without the threat, ready to talk about taking action on those things. So yeah, there are some people who want to still slice and dice, and in order to accommodate everyone in a 140,000 person company, we put those in for those people who want to do it. But it is not a requirement in the tool, and it's not the focus of the conversation. So when we come together, regardless of what business unit you're in, this is what we're talking about, this Foursquare and the development actions connected to it, not whether you think someone is high potential or high professional or emerging talent. Not important.
Question back here.
Hi, my name is Laura Mann with Manulife Financial, and this is very, very timely, as was already mentioned, but we recently have moved to what we're calling a 5-box, so similar to the Foursquare approach. And so I have two questions, Rob, I think for you. Do you by chance have quotas, so a specific percentage of the population that needs to go in any one square, if you will? And then my second question has to do with bias. So the challenge of bias was introduced earlier in the program, and how does this, if it does, address that?
Yeah. So your first question about is there a certain percentage that we need to have in each box? I wouldn't use the word need. We have seen a trend, and we report that trend. So it's about 70% in stay the course, which kind of makes sense. The vast majority of people are placed in the right role at the right time, and between 5 and 10% in the other categories. And what we do say is most important is that if you've got someone in any category other than stay the course, it's your obligation to get the person out of that category. So if you're in feed them more, give them more and get them into stay the course so they're humming again. If they're in figure it out, get them into the right job so they are in stay the course and they're humming again. And if they're in up or out and you've tried everything you can, exit them from the company. That's the more important, I think, point, less about the percentages, more about the action and the timeliness of the action. In terms of bias, wow. So I'm going to go back to performance management for a second around that. Inherent in assessment of any kind is bias. In traditional performance management and in traditional talent planning, there is bias everywhere. I mean, these guys have made a whole practice of it right here, right? There's bias everywhere. Changing the process may or may not eliminate bias. I can't with any certainty say that the changes we made to performance management eliminated bias. What I will tell you is that legal said to us, if you can get your managers and your employees to talk more often about performance, we are happy. And I believe that the more a manager knows their employees, the more trust that's established between the two, the better the relationship, the less bias creeps in. Now, maybe there's other biases that creep in when you get to know people, but if you know everybody and it becomes more of a level playing field, I think bias goes down. So I can't for certain say that there's no bias in there. It's a human exercise. There has to be bias. But at least my legal counsel said this is much better than what we had before. It marched toward this because anything that has more discussion rather than less is better. And what was fascinating is when we were first thinking about rolling out the changes to performance management, eliminating reviews and ratings and going to more performance, we were really concerned about what the unions in Europe would say. Would they like that? Would they say, no, you can't do that? We absolutely, categorically, every union that we spoke to said, get rid of ratings and talk more. We like that. That's a good thing for us as employees. So I think there's some magic in here. And maybe there is still some bias, but I have to believe there's less.
And if I could draw the parallel again back to performance management. So we know one of the keys to dramatically improving performance management is increasing a quality conversation, right, between two individuals. The same thing if you took it at the organizational level and you're talking about talent, not necessarily talking to the talent, but maybe talking about the talent. Same thing applies, that if you can learn how to get a quality conversation going in the organization about how do we talk about people, what do we look for, and how do we challenge each other on bias, how do we label that bias in the moment that when we're talking about it, because it does seep in big time into talent review processes. But being able to have that conversation and name what you're talking about in the moment or elevate that bias into the room improves the quality of the conversation. And I think I began early on saying I do think that there are a few saving graces in what happens in 9box, and one of those is when people finally find their mojo and they get to that moment where they're talking about talent in the way that they should, great things can come out of those conversations. Sharing talent across the organization, breaking preconceived ideas about people, eliminating bias, all of those things can happen. But the same way a quality conversation is required in performance management, it's required in a talent review process, be it 9box or any other structural format that you use.
And I just want to say, when I read this, going back to the SEEDS model and the types of biases I discussed earlier, you take off the table right away, or you minimize experience bias, because you're now interacting with people on a regular basis, monthly, and so you're going to have more even experience across all your individuals that you're interacting with as a manager. And you take away distance bias because you've interacted with them recently enough. It's not distant in your mind or space because you're forced to engage with them and give them feedback on a regular basis. And then the other thing is by getting rid of all the negative potential or that you have no potential, those three segments of the 9box, you suddenly kill one of the biggest problems with self-fulfilling prophecy, that people are mislabeled as having no potential. That leads you to treat them differently, and then they get less opportunity. So just by going to this model, you've already started to mitigate a number of types of bias that I laid out that are problematic.
What he said.
Two more questions here, and then we'll move on. So, and this one right here.
This is fantastic. Thank you. I work at Hall Capital Partners, which is also in San Francisco. The question I have is, HR people love legal people, or we hate them. So I'm going to assume we love them at this moment. How do we make our legal people be okay with the fact that we are not doing written, formalized ways of documenting behavior and progress in order to be able to help manage potentially the up or out category? How have you gotten to that place so that I don't have legal walking down to my office going, where's the performance evaluation showing me for the past 2 years that they've done a poor job and now you want them gone?
Okay, well, I'll be totally transparent here. let me go back to performance management for a second. When we were starting this work, when I was asked to transform performance management for the company, I insisted that legal be part of the journey from the very beginning, legal and ER, because I didn't want to get to the finish line and have them say exactly what you're saying. Where's the documentation? Right from the start, they were very positive about the fact that we would be talking more, and they felt that talking more frequently, and having better conversations was the key toward improving performance and not ever having to get to the point where you have to sever someone. That said, I mentioned earlier that in our process there's nothing written except if you're on corrective action. We have the same corrective action process today that we had before we made this change 4 years ago. It is highly documented. It starts with a verbal warning and a written warning and a final warning and then termination. It is supported by ER when necessary and legal when necessary. But that's not to say that that helped us in the past fight every case. In fact, what most often made us lose a case in court was a review and a rating, which didn't match the behavior you were trying to sever the employee because of, right? So when legal heard that we would be getting rid of that, they said, oh, yay, this is much better, right? I mean, maybe they didn't say yay, but they were aligned. They said it's not without risk, but it would be much better to have a manager enact corrective action at the moment that they're really feeling like this person is not going to make it and use that as the document trail that's presented in court than to have 2 or 3 years of ratings and reviews that don't match the performance issue that you're trying to exit the person because of. Now, it also speaks to a philosophical thing. I challenge people who say to me, but how can we make this defensible? Performance management should not be designed for the 2% of the organization that you need to exit every year. It just should not be, and it is, unfortunately. Traditional performance management is designed for the least common denominator. It goes with the assumption that managers aren't capable of assessing, and it goes with the assumption that they don't know what to write down, which is probably true. And it's really designed to allocate reward in a way that's defensible, doesn't drive performance. If that's where you're coming from, if that's your performance management process, if that's what you've built, well, that's what you've got. It's something that you're going to take to court with you because you think that that's what drives effective performance. If you change that frame and come to it from a 98% of the people in your company want to perform and they want an opportunity, they want a great career, they want to learn, they want to become masters, they have a growth mindset, they're ready for the challenge, you design a very different performance management process. So design that for everybody and design a corrective action process that keeps you legally safe and just make sure your managers understand when and how to use that and reposition HR to be the people who make sure that when performance is suffering, that process kicks in. I think it's a very different frame, but it's an important different frame.
And Greg, I'd love to come to you because Cigna has eliminated end-of-year ratings. Anything to add to the legal piece?
So we're in the same. We don't have a performance. We've eliminated ratings as well. Yeah, and I would say our experience mirrors the gaps very, very strongly. So from a legal perspective, frankly, their concern wasn't as much the up or out as pay equity and everything else that they would use the ratings for. Our performance kind of management system on kind of performance action plans take care of the up or out, and we have roughly the same process we always had. And like I said, I would say our experience mirrors yours almost entirely. Yep.
Great. In the interest of time, I am going to move us on. Great questions, and you'll have an opportunity to continue questions with the panel after we finish going into our next break. So just take a minute to get us into what's next. What is technology going to help us in figuring out how to better, predict what things like potential are? How can we more accurately identify and predict and more accurately develop? I think that's kind of the question that's on the table. And certainly, technology is going to have some sort of an impact. One of the things that I know GE is doing is now more than ever relying on predictive analytics to help their talent planning process. And managers are able, through one of their tools, just in development starting in 2016, look more broadly across the organization, look across a wide range of performance data about many, many, many individuals. And one of the things GE has reported is that they're starting to see more non-obvious candidates pop up that may have been shut out of a more, kind of traditional 9-box approach. 2 years ago, with Kevin Oxner, and hopefully some of you got to hear Kevin today, Kevin who is at Columbia, we started on a journey with Kevin to think about, from a cognitive perspective, how can we develop an assessment to be able to better predict potential. And Jay, I'm just going to ask you to talk for a couple of minutes what Kevin was trying to get at. And this is still in development, and it's just an example of, I think, where technology is going to take us.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. If you just want to go to the next slide, I'll walk
Sure.
through it. So from the neuroscience perspective, over the last 20 years or so, we've started to realize that there's certain common regions in the brain involved in a subset of tasks. And so you see attentional control and focus and regulation tend to be controlled by the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex across a number of different tasks. And so this can be all lumped together as kind of a core skill set, capacity about focusing, paying attention, and ignoring distractions. We live in the world more than any point in human history where we're distracted by technology. Other core competencies coordinated with different brain regions are adaptive skills. These are like learning and memory. So Leila Devachi's talk discussed a lot of these in the temporal cortex. The next one is social skills. And so to me, this is social cognition, or the regions involved in social neuroscience. So the amygdala, the medial prefrontal cortex. These are regions for reading other people's mind, developing empathy, building and navigating relationships. Another one is personal skills. So this is self-regulation, emotion regulation, self-awareness, and self-knowledge. And you can really think of these as 4 core subdomains that are subserved by different brain regions. So they have different sources, different basic foundations, and are really, you can think of them as different foundations for skills. So focus skills, adaptive skills, social skills, and personal skills. And so when you're evaluating somebody and thinking about potential, one way, based on the brain science, is that you can look at these different dimensions or different skill sets and see where people are. Now, the next thing you can think about is, based on the research, which ones are trainable and which ones are less trainable. And so by the time people are working for your organization and they're 25 or 30 years old, social skills, their capacity to read other people's minds, those parts of the brain are fairly well developed by that point. Those capacities are fairly well developed. So there's certainly differences on those capacities, but at that point, they're hard to train. The alternative is learning and memory skills. And so, although I'm sure you're interacting with a lot of smart people, most people have the capacity to learn and memorize new things based on the appropriate feedback. And so that's a type of skill where there actually might be an enormous amount of opportunity for growth if you give them the right capacities and training to build and understand more information, have the right training, educational seminars, and so forth. So I could go on. I know we're short for time here. But that is just maybe a new way of thinking, building up from brain science about kind of core elements of our cognition, and then thinking about where people rank on each of these and which ones you can fix. So if somebody's struggling and you have them in that one quadrant of your 4-square box, you might think, what dimension are they struggling with? Is it basic social skills? That might be something harder for you to fix. You might need to move them into a different role. On the other hand, if they just don't have the knowledge, that's something where you can train them, educate them. And so that falls under adaptive skills. And so if they're struggling in that domain, they just don't have the understanding of the role, the background, that's a place where you can intervene rather than having to shift them into another role. And so this is kind of gives you a roadmap for thinking about how to not only assess talent early, but also to help people fulfill and optimize the talent that they do have.
Excellent. And I think what we're searching for is what can give us a more evidence-based approach toward analyzing and predicting, and probably most importantly in this conversation, developing. And certainly technology can provide a really strong foundational tool to help us. Hopefully, it's not going to take our place, and particularly around talent discussions, performance management, there's still, I think, a much needed role of conversation between managers. There has to be the wisdom that comes from being any one of these people on the stage here, and no matter what the computer tells you, being able to bring that element of lots of years of experience to help make some of the final decisions. So lots of interesting things to consider. I am going to move us on. Your Foursquare has probably gone viral by now, so be prepared. And we hope that you're ready to start a movement around talent reviews. If you are, leave us a card or let us know. We'd love to see creative, innovative things that any of you might be doing. And stay tuned. Hopefully we're back for another discussion a year from now. And Mary, I'm going to ask you to close us out.
So we were thinking what might be a few prompts that would be useful to you as we send you off for continued reflection for today and even back as you go back to your offices. So we came up with 3 that we thought we would pose to you to take and think about in terms of the space. So the first one would be just the very simple question, do your talent processes actually make a difference? And you heard a lot of discussion up here today about time invested and really what kind of ROI do you get out of that? So ask yourself that tough question as one of the leaders in your business. Second would be more personal to you. So what is your role in actually killing bad practices that exist in your organization? And that can be a little challenging at times because they can be ones that have been long stays in the institution. So we'd ask you to think about that and reflect on what your role is in doing that. And then lastly, in a really perfect state with 0 resistance, imagine what you might do, what 2 to 3 bold changes you might choose to make in your talent processes if you didn't have to worry about that resistance, and then maybe work your way backwards from there. So we really appreciate you joining us for this session after lunch. We appreciate the engagement and being awake again after lunch. We're taking a time now for a break and also the sessions that take us into continued conversations. So we look forward to that, and don't forget to continue to look for opportunities to give us feedback as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.